Let's now look at the Spanish-American Wars of Independence, and a good place to start is with the causes of the conflict. First, let's have a look at the imperial reforms of the second half of the 18th century. And as you probably already know, Europe fought a series of very expensive wars in the 18th century, and to pay for these conflicts, Spain raised taxes and put heavier fiscal burdens on its colonists in the Americas. And not only were taxes raised, but the list of taxable goods was also expanded. And these reforms affected everyone, and they caused many resentments and even some small rebellions. And in addition to heavier taxes, many industries, many goods such as tobacco, liquor, gunpowder, and salt, they were converted to royal monopolies. So prices for these goods tended to go up as they became monopolies. And also, these reforms exacerbated growing tensions between Creole and Peninsular elites. So Creoles in Spanish America, they were the whites born in the colonies, while the Peninsulares, they were the whites born in Spain but who lived in the Americas. And there were well over 1 million Creole whites in Spanish America, but only about 30 to 40,000 Spanish Peninsulares that lived in the Americas. And in these imperial reforms, the royal government favored the Peninsulares over the Creoles. Many Creoles were pushed out of government, and many of the highest salaries went to the Peninsulares. And this created resentment among Creoles and Peninsulares. And the Creoles are really important to this story because they would go on to be many of the leaders of the wars of independence in Spanish America. Also, another cause of the conflict was the rise of liberalism. And liberalism was a political ideology that emerged and grew in popularity in the late 18th century. And liberals promoted ideas such as equality before the law, individual rights, freedom of religion and freedom of speech, free trade, and popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty was this idea of rule by the people and consent of the governed. And many liberals also called for the overthrow of monarchies and the establishment of secular republics. So these were revolutionary ideas in a world of kings and queens. And liberalism provided Creoles with a language to critique these imperial reforms. They read the great liberal thinkers such as Locke, Newton, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Adam Smith. They were also influenced by the American and French revolutions, which were very much liberal revolutions that promoted liberal ideas. Creoles read the American Constitution and the French Declaration of Rights of Man, and they read these with great interest. And these ideas helped Creoles to form a new American identity that was separate from the Spanish Peninsulares. And they began to use this word Americanos to identify themselves. Finally, another major cause of the Spanish-American Wars of Independence was Napoleon's invasion of Spain and Portugal in 1808. And this proved to be the immediate cause of the Wars of Independence. So in 1808, Napoleon overthrew the king of Spain, and he installed his brother, Joseph, as king. And this caused a crisis in government in Spanish America, because the colonists didn't know how to react to this. They didn't know if they should recognize Joseph as the new king of Spain, or if they should hold out for Fernando, who had been put on house arrest. The king of Spain, Fernando, had been put on house arrest during these years. They didn't know where power resided. Was power now, did it reside in Spain, or did it reside in the town councils throughout the Americas? And this crisis, it sparked a lot of political activity and organization throughout the colonies. And it also exacerbated even more these tensions between Creoles and Peninsulares. And the Creoles, they quickly took control of the town councils throughout Spanish America, and they claimed to govern the colonies in the name of King Fernando. And there were some small revolts also that erupted in 1808 and 1809, but the big revolts came in 1810 when they exploded. In Mexico, the War of Independence was initiated by a parish priest, Father Miguel Hidalgo, who you see here on the left. Hidalgo was a Creole, and he had read many of the liberal philosophers who were writing at this time in Europe. In 1810, he led a conspiracy to expel the Spaniards from Mexico. The conspiracy, however, was uncovered by the authorities, but before Hidalgo could be arrested, in the early morning hours of September 16, 1810, he called on his followers to revolt against Spain and to create a government that would treat them more equitably. In Mexico, in the years before 1810, not only were these political conflicts between Creoles and Peninsulares, but the country had experienced some severe droughts, so there was a lot of hardship among the rural poor in Mexico. And Hidalgo's followers were indeed among the poorest in the colony, consisting mostly of indigenous and mestizo Mexicans. And Hidalgo's program was to banish the Spaniards from Mexico, abolish native tribute, outlaw slavery, and he ordered that the lands taken from indigenous villages be returned. And within a few weeks, thousands of impoverished peasants joined Hidalgo's army, and they went on a rampage throughout much of central Mexico. And in fact, the violence soon escalated out of control. They sacked haciendas, mines, and cities. And these events frightened Creoles, and it actually divided the Creoles over the question of independence. So this is part of the reason why the wars of independence in Mexico go on for over a decade. But actually, less than 6 months after his revolt had begun, in 1811, Hidalgo was captured, shot, and quartered. And the revolt was then taken over by another parish priest, who was Jose Maria Morelos. And Morelos was a man of greater military and administrative capability. And these rebellions, again, these were truly rebellions from below. The poor masses were making up the rank and file of these armies. And Morelos, like Hidalgo, was also captured in 1815, and he too was executed. And during the next few years, there were many guerrilla forces, patriot guerrilla forces, that operated throughout the countryside, fighting the Spaniards. But the Spaniards and the colonial government were able to reestablish control over much of the colony. And then finally, in 1821, Mexico gained its independence when one of the leaders of the Spanish army, Agustín de Iturbide, he switched sides and declared Mexico independent, and he took the Spanish army with him. So Spain was not able to reconquer Mexico after that. And also, looking at the map here on the right, you can see that Central America was part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. And so Mexico gains its independence in 1821, but then in 1823, Central America broke away from Mexico. And Central America created what was called the United Provinces of Central America. It was just one united nation. And it lasted from 1823 until 1840, when it finally broke apart. So by 1840, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica had become independent nations. In Spanish South America, it was Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín that led the movement for independence. Bolívar, who you see here on the left, was born in Venezuela. He was a Creole cacao planter and from one of the colony's wealthiest families. From an early age, Bolívar had been influenced by liberal thinkers. He had been a leader of a Masonic lodge that in 1911 declared complete independence from Spain. Within a few years, his forces had expanded to number 2,000, which was much smaller than the movement in Mexico. But Bolívar had successes until King Ferdinand was restored to his throne in 1815 after Napoleon's defeat, which allowed Spain to send a large military expedition of 10,000 soldiers to South America to reconquer the lost territory. Bolívar went into exile, and Venezuela was once again a Spanish colony. In 1816, he reorganized his forces to invade northern South America. Bolívar made promises to the free-colored population and recruited among slaves, but his movement was more top-down than the one had been in Mexico. He soon liberated Venezuela and Colombia and then invaded Ecuador. From the south, San Martín, one of the most talented generals of the period, organized forces in Buenos Aires, which he first liberated. Central to his goal was the liberation of the Viceroyalty of Peru. San Martín mobilized the Army of the Andes, a force of some 5,000 troops, nearly half of whom were slaves. In 1817, San Martín crossed the Andes and marched into Chile, and you can see here on the map his movements. No one expected him to take an army across the high peaks of the mountains, and thus the royalists in Chile were surprised, and the patriots quickly took Santiago. In 1820, San Martín sailed with several thousand Chileans and Argentines to Peru. A year later, they entered Lima and the independence of Peru was proclaimed. And it was there where he met and joined forces with Bolívar. The most decisive battle of all the wars occurred at Ayacucho and led to an unconditional surrender of all the royalist forces in Peru. In 12 months, then, San Martin and Bolivar had defeated a royalist army of 18,000 soldiers. So in this way, most of Spanish America was liberated from Spanish rule. However, two exceptions remained, and those were Cuba and Puerto Rico. Cuba and Puerto Rico did not experience a movement for independence at this time because the elites were still frightened by what had occurred next door in Haiti and not willing to flirt with independence. And we'll be talking about slavery in the coming weeks and the growth of the sugar economy in Cuba. Cuba and Puerto Rico would remain Spain's last colonies in the Americas until 1898.